Hello, you are listening to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome Podcast. My name is Shaimond, and today's special guest is Professor Robin Walker for the Department of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. Robin is a cognitive neuroscientist with interest in vision, including reading and macular degeneration, and recently Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So how you doing today, Professor Walker?
Yeah, good. Pleased to meet you, Shaimond. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm glad that you're here, and I know you're doing some exciting things, and I look forward to talking about them.
Thank you. I've listened to quite a few episodes of your podcast already, and I feel I'm in very good company here with there's some really excellent interviews you've already done.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So if you can talk a little bit about yourself and just tell the listeners a little bit about what it is that you do.
Yeah, sure. I'm not a clinician, but I'm a doctor by PhD, and my research interests over the past sort of 30 years or so have been in visual perception, particularly the human eye movement system, because we move our eyes around all the time to bring that area of high acuity, the macular region of the eye, which is the area that's damaged in macular degeneration. So I've been interested in macular disease, which is how I eventually came to hear about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. One of your guests, Jonathan Ward, who really enjoyed his episode, he and I met a couple of years ago. He has some kind of central vision loss caused by a form of macular disease, he thinks. And he's used an app that I developed for reading for people who've got some remaining vision that scrolls text, a bit like a news ticker from right to left, one line at a time. And that's something I've done some research in over the years, is how scrolling text can be a way of supporting reading for people with essential vision loss. And Jonathan's very kindly was an advocate for that app and is somebody who's used it. And I think he said he used it for reading books to his own children. So it was nice to know that something as an academic you develop, some people in the real world have found useful.
So can you tell me a little bit about that app? Is it called the EV Reader or an EV app?
Yeah, you're right. So initially, we had an app called the MD, which stands for Macular Degeneration EV Reader app, which was available on the Apple App Store. What we found is that trying to keep up with changes in technology is difficult. So we've got a web browser version instead, known as evplatform.org. So it's EV, which stands for eccentric viewing, and then a form dash, so ev-platform.org. And it's a website that allows you to scroll text from ebooks, or you can copy and paste a paragraph of text into it and it will scroll it from right to left, and you can change the speed that it scrolls. It also allows you to scroll current news items. There's a little glitch at the minute, and my app developer's trying to sort it for me, which is something I've discovered I don't really have a budget for keeping on top of technology when it changes, and things do seem to change. And it's something as an individual, it's really hard to keep something technological like this up running for many years, which can be a bit of a frustration. But at the moment, we are trying to get it fixed so people could use it. And there are some little audio guides to explain how it works. Might be something we can put in your show notes, actually.
Yes, certainly. I will leave a link to the app and the web app, and that is really interesting. It's amazing what you can do with technology, and you just gave me an idea. I actually thought about it, but put it on a back burner. I actually want to have an episode where I just talk about different apps and different technology that's available to help the blind and the low vision community. I'll start compiling some things, and I'll definitely add your web app to that list.
That's a really good idea. There's so many clever apps out there now. The apps that allow you to use your mobile phone to point at objects, and it will tell you what that is, something you might not be able to see, or things that can read text out, text to speech. There's so many things out there now. It's amazing. I guess nobody back in the day thought iPhones would become accidentally such great vision aids.
That is so amazing. I definitely will do that. I just wanted to mention a few apps. So they have Be My Eyes, which is actually something that volunteers will connect with people that actually have a visual impairment, and then the person will actually request a volunteer and they'll come on and help them with tasks by using their camera. And they also have Seeing AI, which was only available on iOS, but now recently within this past year, it's available on Android. And that uses artificial intelligence. You can point it at objects and things, and it'll read the text, read the currency, and read all sorts of things. And they have Google Lookout, which is the Android version of Seeing AI. And I'll save the rest for that episode when I compile that list. But it's amazing because people say a lot of bad things about technology, and there are challenges and there is a negative side to that, like anything, but there's definitely a positive side to it too. So I just didn't want to leave people hanging, and I just wanted to mention a few that a lot of people are aware of, but if one or two people heard about something that they didn't know about and they can incorporate that or get that app, that will be a great thing.
When I started developing an app for people with macular degeneration, this is more than 10 years ago, the initial response is, oh, these people tend to be elderly people, don't use technology. And that is obviously so not true now, that it's very hard to find people who don't have a smartphone and who use them in all kinds of ways. And that being able to use your fingers to scroll something on a screen just by itself is such a useful thing. So I think the idea that lots of visually impaired people tend to be elderly, but that doesn't mean they don't use technology.
Yeah, that is so true. And thanks for mentioning that, because some people may start out using technology slowly or have a little bit of a fear, but once they get over that hump, they will actually embrace it. And now they have a lot of libraries that help people, and they have organizations that help people and connect them and teach them how to use different things, whether it's something like Excel or whether it's one of these apps or your browser. If anyone's listening, don't be scared. Reach out for help and keep trying, because there's someone that can share this information. And also YouTube, you can listen to it. You can hear what people say. There's people on there that actually have channels that are blind or visually impaired, and they're able to edit their videos and they give tutorials and tips on how to live your best life with a visual impairment. And since I'm a caregiver for someone with a visual impairment who actually has Charles Bonnet Syndrome, I subscribe to a lot of those channels. And now with this podcast, I try to learn even more and try to be a resource for other people.
Yes. And it's also the case that you may already have the technology. And if you've got a tablet device or a smartphone, you might not need to go out and buy some bespoke piece of equipment. You might already have something really useful there that you can download some apps that may be free. Some of them you may have to pay for them, but either way, you may already have a lot of tools at your fingertips.
And you never know where a conversation is going to go, because technology is very important, because we're living in a tech savvy world and it's all around us. And I actually developed an app years ago, something unrelated, so I won't even get into it, but it was difficult trying to find someone that could actually program the app and do the things that are necessary. And now they have things like ChatGPT and all of these other kind of Google Gemini and all of these things. And I haven't tried it for myself and I'm not a programmer, but I've heard that they can actually do programming and debug and fix things. And it's possible maybe that you can use some of this AI to help like a layman like me make an app, or someone else that has an idea. So who knows? I don't know how advanced it is. I can't verify that, but I have heard that. So as many people are scared that AI is going to take their job, and it may take some jobs, it's going to create some other opportunities and potentially level the playing field. So if we can get back to Charles Bonnet, can you first tell me when you first found out about Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and how did you find out about the condition?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it relates to one of your other guests, Judith Potts, who has formed her support organization, Esme's Umbrella, and she talks really eloquently in her episode of your podcast about the history of that. And back in 2018 in London, so this was about a year or so before COVID hit, just over a year, she organized with the Macular Society in the UK an event to raise awareness that I went along to. And it was quite surprising to me that, as somebody who's for many decades been active in researching things about vision, I'd never come across it. And there were people who spoke about their personal experience at that meeting of having Charles Bonnet, and certainly some of them were quite unpleasant. There was a youngish man who described how he has some really unpleasant hallucinations that are always with him, and they had blood streaming from eye sockets, and they were clearly quite disturbing things. And so I suppose from that point, I thought, this sounds really interesting. And when you read the accounts, I think going back to Charles Bonnet himself, who described the hallucinations that his own grandfather reported seeing. Some of them, are really curious, but there are these consistent reports of things like people in period costume or gargoyle-like distorted faces, as well as much more simple visual things like perhaps patterns or brickwork patterns or shapes or fireworks. Given that awareness of it is so low, it can't be that people are reporting these things because they've been suggested to them. If you start to lose your sight, you might start to see people who are dressed as soldiers from the First World War or small Lilliputian children or these sorts of things. So it can't be because they've heard of it somewhere. And yet there are these consistent reports. So really what we think, the sort of current level of understanding that Judith also explains, is the eye and the retina is only the very first part of the process of seeing and visual perception. And then after that, there's a large part of the visual brain, the cortex of the brain, that are involved in translating that into what we see. And perception and vision is a very active process, which is why we're able to recognize maybe a cartoon of a politician, a familiar person. Just a few lines from a sketch are very compelling. And you can put two apples and a banana down on a table and make a smiley face. So your brain is seeing things, interpreting the world out there in an active way. And we know there are parts of the visual cortex that are specialized for seeing things that start in quite a simple way, like lines and edges. And then we build them up into objects and scenes, so we can recognize a chair and a table and a coffee cup. And if people have maybe a stroke that affects these parts of the brain, then maybe they will be unable to recognize a familiar object. They'll be able to describe it, but they'll no longer be able to say what a cup is, types of what we call object agnosia. Or you can also have specialized parts of the brain that are involved with seeing people. And there's a region devoted to face processing, which is something we're really good at. So the idea is that as people have some kind of damage to their eye or retina, so they're getting a reduced visual input, but the brain is somehow filling in and overcompensating. And at any one time, somebody might see a sort of pattern or shape or a face or a distorted gargoyle-like face. I guess what's not clear is why people see people dressed in period costume from 100 years ago rather than seeing people dressed like they should be now in the modern world, which is what we're probably seeing much more often in our lifetime. So I think there's some really interesting questions about Charles Bonnet syndrome. When you read reports, and it's understandable that because the majority of people, as people grow older, is the time you start to have problems with your eyes. And an awful lot of people over the age of 60 and 70 may develop macular degeneration, for example, or cataracts or glaucoma and things that impair their vision. So there's going to be far more people having Charles Bonnet syndrome who are old, simply because eye conditions and visual impairments are more common in the elderly. So I think one of the first studies I got involved with, that we can talk about in a minute, came around during the sort of COVID years, because I had two students, they were postgraduate students in their 20s, who had studied at a college in the UK for visually impaired people. It's based in Herefordshire. I think one of your other guests, it might have been Robin Davis, talked about it. I think it was. So it's a college for people with visual impairments. It's the Royal National College for the Blind, based in Herefordshire. They came to see me and said they were going to do, as part of their master's degree, they have to do a research project. And because it was the COVID years, I suggested perhaps we could do some kind of an online survey of people with visual impairments, and were they aware of people who report seeing things and hallucinations. And these are people that the college they attended, I think the oldest students there are 25 years old. So these are young people. And they said, yes, they did know people who had visual hallucinations. So what we decided to do was an online survey of younger age people with vision loss. So we had over the age of 18, but younger than 60. And we tried to promote our survey through Facebook sites, including Esme's Umbrella, through people who attended this college and more widely to recruit people. And at the end of the day, we had 29 people who completed the survey from beginning to end. And I would say it's not necessarily easy for people with visual impairments to answer an awful lot of questions that maybe they're on a 5-point scale. How often do you have hallucinations, where 1 is very rarely and 5 is very frequently all the time? So you can understand that maybe to some people trying to complete a web-based survey isn't easy, but we did manage to get 29 people who completed the survey, and we hopefully are going to publish the results in the coming year or so. But I can give you a little overview of the study that the 2 students and I performed.
Sure, that sounds good.
We managed to get complete responses from 29 people, and the average age of them was 44 years, but we had I think the youngest person was 21, and almost half of these were under 40 years of age. So I think this makes the first point about Charles Bonnet syndrome, is that it isn't something that is linked to being old. So what we found, and it's another very common finding, is that the key is having sight loss, but it's a very wide range of causes. One of the most common causes in elderly people is macular degeneration. But Charles Bonnet, we were seeing people reporting glaucoma, hereditary juvenile forms of macular degeneration, cataract. Some people had lost their sight through accidents. It's not linked to any particular retinal disorder or eye disease. We found that half the people had experienced hallucination for at least 3 to 4 years, and the longest that somebody said there's 10 years or more. So I think that's another thing, that there is a view that as you're losing your sight, the hallucinations may stop. And in some cases, I think that is true. That is what occurs. But for other people, they can carry on. So about half the people said their hallucinations were very brief, so under a minute in duration. But a third of people said they were always present, so they were always seeing things. And round about half the people said they didn't find them particularly unpleasant, but a third of the people did regard them as being unpleasant. And we found that there was a relationship between how often people experience hallucinations and how unpleasant people rated them. And you can understand that the more often you're having hallucinations, the more unpleasant you find them. We also asked a question, because Charles Bonnet syndrome isn't necessarily just a purely, say, visual or lack of visual input problem. I think it relates to what you can think of as psychosocial problems like isolation, loneliness, depression and anxiety or other factors. And these are things we included questions in our survey about: depression, anxiety, loneliness. And linked to loneliness, there were anecdotal reports during the COVID lockdown years that some people experienced more hallucinations. So we asked a question: did your hallucinations worsen during the COVID-19 lockdowns? What we found of our 29 respondents, 7 people thought that their hallucinations had worsened, but for 19, they said there was no change, and 2 people said their symptoms improved. I guess what I've realized since is that it's not, if you like, a sort of level playing field, because people's vision may have also changed during 1 or 2 years of lockdown, and some people's vision might have improved, although rarely, or others may have worsened. And I think it's not just necessarily people were more lonely during the COVID years, because some people, my own experience during COVID was I was at home, but with 3 young adult children and my wife. So it definitely wasn't a lonely environment. But for some people, maybe who do live alone, it would have been a time of great loneliness. So there are these sort of psychosocial factors. And we did find that half of our respondents were on a standardized questionnaire about depression. Around about half of them were either depressed or borderline depressed. And 65% of them would be rated as being anxious or borderline anxious. And a similar number scored quite highly on measures of loneliness. These are, if you like, risk factors for affecting the symptoms of hallucinations, and they they seem to vary not only in terms of the content, so whether you see brick-like patterns or fireworks or simple visual things, as opposed to seeing incredible things like horses and carriages or gargoyle-like distorted faces. But they can also vary in terms of how often people experience hallucinations in a day. So some people might only have one or two a day. Other people experience them continuously. For some people, they're really brief and short-lasting, but for other people, they go on for many minutes or hours. And perhaps these things are in some way linked to things that aren't really strictly visual, like depression, anxiety, and loneliness. So that was the first study we did. And the two students are actually really brilliant at driving this. And it was my first foray into Charles Bonnet syndrome. The very final finding of interest was that we're starting to see an association. And because we only had 29 people completed the study, it was not necessarily the strongest association between people who scored more highly on the depression scale, so were more depressed, and how often they experience hallucinations. And that's something we're seeing a little bit more of in our second study. So that's how I came about since 2018, thanks to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome Awareness Day in London, how I got an interest in it.
Judith Potts is doing so many great things to bring awareness to this condition. So I'm actually not surprised that you found out about the condition through her and her efforts, but it's great that you took a liking to this condition. So there's so many conditions out there and there's so many things you can do research for. What made you focus on Charles Bonnet with your research?
I guess the stimulus really for me, going beyond just thinking this is interesting, was having the two students who were young and knew other young people who had the condition. So I think that's what motivated me. And then as we were performing that study, I applied to the Macular Society for some funding for a second study, which we're running now. So we've got a 2-year grant funded by the Macular Society to evaluate some of these techniques that are suggested as ways of trying to manage hallucinations or improve hallucinations. So this is a study that's open to anyone over the age of 18 years with vision loss from any cause who experiences visual hallucinations. The strict definition of Charles Bonnet syndrome is that they are purely visual. There's no auditory component to them. So you're not hearing the people. People will be silent. I think there can be a link. Some people seem to report their hallucinations might be triggered by sounds, but that's not the same as they have an auditory component to them. So what we're trying to do is evaluate some of the therapies techniques that are suggested for people with Charles Bonnet syndrome. And we're trying to screen out people who have other conditions that might be linked to causing hallucinations, like dementia or certain neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease or psychiatric conditions. So the eligibility criterion is over the age of 18 with vision loss of any cause, but without signs of dementia or psychiatric or neurological conditions. And if people take part in the study, initially they complete a survey very much like the one we did with the younger age people that asks them a range of questions about their hallucinations, about their sight loss condition. And it had some standardized questionnaires about depression, anxiety, and loneliness. And then if after completing that, they appear eligible for our study and they're willing to continue, we randomly allocate the person to one of our therapy strategy groups, and we ask them to try it for 1 month whenever they experience a hallucination, whenever practical to do, and keep a weekly diary of their hallucinations. So questions like, how often did you have a hallucination this week? How long did they last? How distressing did you find it? How often did you try the therapy that you've been asked to try? And then after 1 month, they complete a final short survey, which we call a sort of treatment satisfaction survey. So the study is open for around about 12 months from now. We're in May 2024. We've had about 60 people who've completed the first survey itself, who've entered the study. 1 or 2 people have found, for a variety of reasons, they haven't completed the 1-month evaluation. But we have some preliminary data that's quite interesting that maybe I can come back in a year's time and tell you about our findings. There are some common themes, and I think one which relates to your podcast and Esme's umbrella and other organizations like the Macular Society that are raising awareness of Charles Bonnet, which is that people are really pleased that there is some research taking place. And they also feel that just being told about it and being reassured that it's not the sign of having something else wrong with them, like a psychiatric condition, they have found that itself is really important and reassuring. We've also found, like our earlier study, and there are some studies of Charles Bonnet in children, for example. So I think Jonathan Ward, who is in one of your episodes, said he was 4 years old when he thinks he started to hallucinate. And certainly we're seeing it, although our study is only open to people over the age of 18, we're seeing it in people across all ages with a wide range of different eye conditions. And we're seeing this sort of variation in 60% of people say they experience hallucinations daily or continuously, and only half the people say they're quite fleeting. It's an ongoing study, so I don't really want to talk too much about the therapies themselves that are suggested, partly because for the 1-month period, we want people to just try one technique, which isn't necessarily simple because people may already be trying something that they feel works. But we have the ability for people to complete a free text box to describe their other things that they may try or try to use. So we are open to recruitment. We initially started to target people here in the UK only, but we can include people from anywhere else around the world. I have a couple of researchers helping me with the study who are able to, if it's in the UK, contact people by telephone to help them complete the surveys. They ask the questions and complete the surveys for them. Or it may be possible to use something like Zoom to call people. But ideally, I suppose from our perspective, it would be better if people could complete the surveys, maybe with a family member or some other assistance, rather than having to rely on us contacting people, especially given the time difference with other countries. So it is a study we're recruiting for at the moment. It'll be running for probably about another 12 months from now. And the first step, if anybody wants to drop us an email to volunteer because they're interested in taking part, or they might have a family member or be caring for someone, then if they could drop us an email on the following Gmail account, which is cbs.study1, that's the number 1, at gmail.com. And I think, Shaimond, you said you would be able to put this in the notes for the podcast as well.
Yes, I will. So first, I just want to say thank you for what you're doing, and thanks for giving the details of the study and sharing, because that was very informative. I'm glad that you opened it up to people that are in different countries, because we look at the UK as pretty much the leader of CBS research and awareness, a lot because of Dominic Fitch, a lot because of Judith Potts, and even people like yourself. But we need help in other places too. So that's so good that you can open this study up to people in different places. And as we know, CBS affects people all over the world and different cultures in different countries. So it's good for them to be able to participate too. The more people, the merrier. So hopefully someone can reach out to you and your team, and I'm sure that will benefit the study.
And I think it relates to something I was touching upon there. I think raising awareness of it, and your podcast is going to be a great vehicle for this. And you were talking to me earlier about perhaps providing people with more information about some of these techniques that maybe they can try, as well as also about apps and technology as well for trying to overcome or help people make the best use of their preserved vision. But I think trying to just provide people with information about what they can do, what the simple techniques are that they might want to try, which certainly Esme's Umbrella and the Macular Society and the RNIB here in the UK do have information on their websites about things people can try to help reduce the severity of their hallucinations.
Yes, and I actually just recorded an episode on this podcast where I actually talk about coping mechanisms and general tips and natural remedies. So I'm going to release that soon, and hopefully that will help some people, because people have been asking about some of the information that I've been able to compile, talking to all of these experts, and most importantly, talking to people that actually have the condition, because they can give firsthand accounts.
I think it'll be a really useful resource. I think that's an excellent idea, and I think you're doing a great job.
I really appreciate that. So you mentioned earlier that you get Charles Bonnet when you have a visual impairment, and it doesn't really matter what caused a visual impairment. It can be an injury, it can be different types of diseases. When you have a condition like that, is that more difficult for you to research? Because it's one thing if you just say you get macular degeneration, then there's a chance you'll get Charles Bonnet. But when it could be an eye injury, or when it could be glaucoma or cataracts, I would assume from someone that's not a researcher or a doctor, that could cause more challenges to research. And also when you have commonalities, there are a lot. And I do hear about the men in period clothing, but as many commonalities as there are, CBS is unique to each person too. There are a lot of differences too. So does that make it challenging? I just would love to know your thoughts and how you deal with that as a researcher, and just anything you have to say about what I just said.
I think from my perspective, in some ways, the fact that it's such a sort of almost like a shotgun approach to eye disorders, and I'm just looking at some of the things people have reported: cataracts, macular degeneration, blood clot, malignant melanoma, cone rod dystrophy, uveitis with other conditions, surgery, accidents, non-age related macular degeneration, that it's easier for us to recruit people for our study because it is any eye condition. So that opens it out. And then I don't think there's any relationship between the specific condition that's caused the vision loss and the nature of the hallucinations. It might be linked to how much preserved vision there is. And I think that's one of the things about macular degeneration, which is that people lose their central vision, but the peripheral outside parts of vision remain, certainly for quite some years, which is why people use this technique called eccentric viewing, because they've still got some preserved vision, but it's not seeing at the same level of detail as you do with your macular fovea region. So I think maybe having some visual input is what's stimulating these parts of the visual cortex that are perhaps triggering the hallucinations. And then presumably there's some kind of feedback from what we call higher regions of the brain involved with more of the interpreting process. And it may also be that the emotional content to things reinforces that. So if you initially see something that's a little bit frightening or upsetting, that negative emotional reaction may reinforce this visual hallucination in what we would call top-down way. So from a higher region back down to lower parts of the cortex. So from my perspective, it's easier to recruit people than targeting one specific disorder. But I'm not aware of any links between the nature of the eye condition and the nature of the hallucinations.
I know research is ongoing, but do you think that it's a possibility that one day researchers will find that there's like a spectrum, just like autism, and some people are higher or lower on the spectrum when it comes to Charles Bonnet syndrome, because the way it affects them and the types of hallucinations they have and the frequency and severity seem to be so different?
Yeah, and it depends. Because there are different ways of measuring. You can measure it so in terms of how often do you have them and how long do they last, but also in terms of how pleasant or how distressing and how do they impact on your quality of life. There isn't a single way of characterizing them into a sort of scale in that way, unless you perform an overall score, perhaps out of different measures like the frequency and duration of hallucinations, plus there's valence, how pleasant or unpleasant, and how much the impact on quality of life. Yeah, I think it's interesting because there doesn't necessarily seem to be a very clear relationship between any of the hallucination type questions and how much they impact on people. Some people experience things all the time, but they quite enjoy it. They quite like seeing patterns and things all over wherever they look, whereas to other people, they find them quite unpleasant. So I'm not quite sure if it'll be that easy to summarize it in terms of a spectrum disorder where you're somewhere on the scale. But I think it will be useful to, I think something else that some people in the UK are thinking, that maybe we need some standardized assessment of Charles Bonnet. So people are all asking the same kinds of questions to come up with a common scale for visual hallucinations in Charles Bonnet syndrome. I think that will be something quite useful. And I think it will help researchers if people aren't all developing their own measures, but there is some standardization of them.
Someone said that they would be conducting research and then someone would say, hey, I'm doing some research on this. And they said, well, I already did that research. And I was like, wow, it would be good if it was a better way to have like a uniform system of knowing what research is done or not. And they said there is a system. It's probably challenging, but we don't want to waste resources doing a lot of things that have been done already. So what's some ways that maybe people can prevent duplicative research?
People publish papers in academic journals, and then people can search for them and read them. But what you do tend to find sometimes as a researcher is, so if we take that particular question about having a standardized set of maybe 6 or 10 questions about hallucinations, when you come to think about what it is you want to do, the things that have already been done don't necessarily fit perfectly your own, if you like, your own research questions. So you've got to develop your own materials for your own specific study. So the idea of developing standardized scales that everybody's going to use isn't that simple. And if I give you one perhaps example as some quality of life measures, there are certain measures of measuring quality of life for a whole range of diseases to see how, maybe if you have Parkinson's disease, how does that impact on your quality of life? And there are quality of life scales developed for people with visual impairments, but maybe they don't necessarily suit the type of research you're trying to carry out. So that's sometimes why people end up reinventing the wheel and developing their own. And that can make it difficult to compare across studies, because if you haven't got the same necessarily, especially in Charles Bonnet syndrome, you've got people, maybe younger age people in one study or older age people in another, and then they've used different measures and scales. So there isn't one accepted measuring tool for every study for when you're testing people with vision loss. And I don't necessarily think it'd be a good thing if there was, but some standardization of hallucination questionnaires would be really useful. And then some suggestion, or perhaps if you're going to measure depression in people with vision loss, which is the best scale to use for depression, and questions like that. And it would be good, I think, if researchers tried to come up with some suggestions to standardize these.
Is there anything else you would like to discuss?
It'd be great if we could get some people to volunteer for our study so we can try to get enough people to make some sense of the data overall. You've got to have quite a few people who finish this 1-month evaluation to be able to say something, and I think that would be fantastic. If people feel they want to try EV platform to see if it helps them read, and it definitely won't work for everyone. It's something very specific to people who've got some remaining peripheral vision from our previous work. But no, it's just really nice to be able to chat about Charles Bonnet syndrome and be one small part of trying to raise awareness and do something for people who have the condition.